Wealth does not begin when money arrives, it begins when money is restrained. Most people have spent their entire earning lives waiting to see what remains at the end of the month, never once questioning whether the order itself was the problem. They were taught to earn, to spend, and to save what survives. And that sequence, passed down without examination, is the quiet architecture of financial instability. Solomon understood something about money that has been buried beneath centuries of noise. That sequence determines survival, and what is not protected first will not remain later. This is not a principle he invented, it is one he observed, recorded, and practiced inside a framework so structurally sound that it outlasted every empire around it. The wealth habit we are examining today is not about discipline in the way most people define it, it is about order, and the one predecision that changes everything downstream. If this challenges how you have always thought about money, stay until the end. Wealth does not begin when money arrives. It begins when money is restrained. Read that again, not when it is earned, not when it is invested, not when it is multiplied. Wealth begins the moment a person chooses deliberately, quietly, without negotiation, to restrain a portion of what has come in. Most people have never been taught this, and what is more revealing is that most people do not realize they have never been taught it. They have been taught to earn. They have been taught to spend wisely. They have been told, occasionally, to save what remains. But the order of those instructions contains a flaw so fundamental that it quietly dismantles whatever is built on top of it. We are going to examine that flaw today, not with urgency, not with alarm, with the calm, structured clarity that ancient wisdom always carried. Because this is not a new problem, it is an old one, and the answer has existed far longer than modern finance. Consider the pattern most earners live inside without ever naming it. Income arrives, obligations are addressed. Daily life proceeds, and at the end of the cycle, whether weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, there is a quiet hope, a small internal negotiation, a search for surplus. The question is always some version of, what is left? If something remains, it is set aside. If nothing remains, the cycle resets. And the month begins again with the same quiet hope that this time, the number will be different. This is not a failure of character, it is a failure of structure. And structure, unlike character, can be corrected without self-blame. Here is what that pattern produces over time. The income grows, perhaps modestly, perhaps significantly, but the surplus never reliably appears. The lifestyle adjusts upward to meet the new income. The obligations expand in proportion. And the person earning more in their 5th year than they ever imagined in their first still arrives at month's end, searching for the same small surplus they searched for at the beginning. This is not rare. It is the dominant financial experience of the modern earner. It has a name. Economists call it lifestyle inflation. But that term, precise as it is, misses the deeper cause. It suggests the problem is expansion, that people spend too much, desire too much, consume too much, perhaps, but the more accurate observation is not about the size of spending. It is about the order in which decisions are made. What comes first determines what survives. And in this structure, earn, spend, save what remains. What is placed first is consumption. What is placed last is protection. And anything placed last will be the first thing eliminated when pressure arrives. This is the illusion. The modern earner believes they are building. They are, in fact, spending forward and hoping that something will hold itself in reserve without a structure designed to hold it. Now, before we dismantle this further, we need to go somewhere older. There is a body of wisdom that has survived thousands of years, not because it was popular, but because it was structurally sound. It was tested not in theory, but in the management of real households, real trade, real long-term survival, the kind of survival that spans not one lifetime, but several. Solomon, a name that carries weight regardless of one's tradition, regarded across ancient records as a figure of extraordinary administrative and philosophical intelligence. Not simply wealthy, structurally wealthy, the distinction matters. His wisdom was not accidental. It was the product of disciplined observation. The book of Proverbs, attributed in substantial part to Solomon, is not a collection of inspiration. It is a compressed manual of structured living. Every line was earned by watching what sustained households and what dismantled them, what produced long-term stability and what produced the illusion of it. Proverbs 21:5 carries a line that has been translated many ways, but its structural truth remains constant across all of them. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. Most readings of this passage focus on diligence as effort. Work harder, stay disciplined, do more. But look again at the structure of the sentence. It is not diligence in activity that is contrasted with haste. It is diligence in planning, the plans of the diligent. The emphasis is on predecision, on what is decided before action begins, on the structure that exists before the moment of temptation or impulse arrives. Diligence, in the ancient framework, was not simply industriousness. It was the discipline of pre-commitment, of deciding in advance what would happen, rather than waiting for circumstance to shape behavior. And the consequence of haste, of acting without a pre-decided plan, of moving reactively, was not mild inconvenience. It was poverty. Not immediately, but surely, because what is not protected by structure will be consumed by circumstance. Every time. Ancient households understood this deeply. They did not manage money by monitoring what remained. They managed it by separating what was protected before anything else moved. The first portion was not what was left. It was what was taken first. Always. Without reconsideration, sequence determined survival. This was not a suggestion in those households. It was the law that governed financial order. Now let us address the assumption that sits at the center of almost every modern conversation about building wealth. The assumption is this: to have more, one must earn more. It is stated so frequently, and accepted so naturally, that most people have never paused to examine it. More income, higher salary, additional streams. The focus is always on the input, on increasing the number that arrives, as though the arrival of a larger number will by itself produce the stability that smaller numbers failed to produce. Consider two individuals. Each earns the same income, the same number deposited on the same day of every month. Their external lives appear similar, their obligations are comparable, but one of them is stable, the other resets monthly. Not because of luck, not because of inheritance. Not because one works harder or spends more carefully on individual purchases. The difference is structural. One person has a pre-decided allocation that never varies. The other is evaluating, each month, whether the circumstances allow for any preservation. The first person is not more disciplined in their daily decisions. They made fewer decisions by design. The preservation happened automatically, before the psychology of spending had any territory to operate in. The second person is making dozens of micro-decisions every month. Decisions about what matters more, what can wait, what feels justified, and because those decisions are made after the income has arrived and become visible and available, emotion has already entered the calculation. This is the structural flaw. Stated plainly, protection placed last will be negotiated away, every time, not because of weakness, because of how human decision-making works under conditions of availability. What is not protected first will not remain later. The income size is not the problem. The allocation order is the problem. An order is not determined by what you earn. It is determined by what you decide. In advance, will move before anything else. The ancient wisdom has a name for this discipline when applied to financial structure. For the purposes of this narration, we will call it what it is. The first portion, law, not a strategy, not a savings rate, a law. Because the distinction between a strategy and a law is important. A strategy is evaluated. It is adjusted when circumstances feel different. It is reconsidered when opportunity presents itself. It is suspended when discomfort arrives. A strategy belongs to the realm of negotiation. A law does not negotiate. The first portion law is this: a fixed percentage of all income is separated immediately upon receipt, designated for a pre-decided purpose, and never reclassified for lifestyle use. Fixed. Pre-decided, immediate, non-negotiable. The percentage is not the subject of this narration. What matters is the structure. The principle that a defined portion of every inflow exists outside the territory of daily life before daily life has any opportunity to absorb it. It is not saved from what remains. It is removed from what is considered available in the first place. This is not an emotional discipline. It does not require motivation. It does not depend on how the month feels. It is structural, and structure, once established, operates independently of emotion. A law only works when it is not negotiated. Now here is where something fundamental shifts. Because understanding the first portion law intellectually is not enough. In fact, intellectual understanding without identity, change produces nothing. The earner who understands the principle but continues to identify as someone who saves what they can will continue to behave accordingly. There are two identities in this space, not good and bad, not wise and foolish, simply two distinct internal frameworks for how a person relates to the income they receive. The first identity is the spender. This is not a pejorative term. It is a structural description. The spender experiences income as available. When money arrives, it belongs to the present. Its purpose is to meet the obligations and desires of the current period. Preservation is something that happens after all current needs, including psychological needs, have been addressed. The second identity is the separator. When income arrives, the separator does not experience it as fully available. A portion of it has already been mentally allocated before the deposit cleared. There is no decision to make in the moment. The movement is automatic because the decision was made in advance. Disciplined families, the ones whose financial stability compounds across years, rather than resets monthly, never ask what remains. The question is not part of their financial vocabulary. It was removed from the decision architecture before the money arrived. This is not an exaggeration. It is a behavioral observation. Identity forms around first action. What a person does first with income tells them at a subconscious level who they are in relation to money. The person who moves their first portion immediately is telling themselves something each time they do it. They are reinforcing, through action, that they are not someone who waits, not someone who hopes, not someone who negotiates with their own financial future. They are a separator. To adopt the law, one must adopt the identity, and here is what most conversations about wealth leave out entirely. The psychological mechanism underneath this identity shift is not about motivation or willpower. It is something quieter, something structural, something that ancient practice understood long before behavioral economics gave it a name. That mechanism is what we will examine in full in the second half of this narration. Because the law is not just a system, it is a structure that changes what the mind has access to. And once you understand how that works, not theoretically, but mechanically, you will not simply think about wealth differently. You will understand why you ever thought about it the old way at all. Here is the mechanism most people never reach. Not because it is hidden, not because it requires rare knowledge, but because most conversations about wealth stop at the surface, at percentages, accounts, and behavioral tips, and never descend to the layer where the real structural shift occurs. We established in the first half of this narration that the first portion law is not a savings strategy. It is a pre-commitment, a non-negotiable separation of income before the territory of daily life has any access to it. We established that it requires an identity shift from spender to separator, and we established that ancient wisdom, specifically the structured discipline embedded in the Proverbs of Solomon, was built on this exact sequence. Protect first, expand second. Now, we go deeper. Because the reason the first portion law works is not simply that it preserves capital. It works because of what it does to the psychology of the person who practices it consistently. And this effect, this quiet structural rewiring, is something the ancient practitioners understood intuitively, long before there was language precise enough to describe it. Every financial decision a person makes requires cognitive energy. Should I spend this or preserve it? Does this purchase justify itself? Is this the right moment? Can I afford this and still meet my obligations? These questions, and the hundreds of variations of them that move through a person's mind each month, are not weightless. They accumulate. They produce friction. They create the conditions for what researchers now call decision fatigue, a state in which the quality of decisions degrades in proportion to the number of decisions already made. The modern earner, operating under the earn-spend-save structure, is making preservation decisions constantly. Every day, income that has arrived and become available is being quietly negotiated against. And every time a spending decision is made, even a small one, a portion of that cognitive energy is consumed. By the time the question of preservation arrives at the end of the month, it is not being evaluated with the same clarity it would have received at the beginning. It is being evaluated by a mind that has already made dozens of allocation decisions, all of which depleted the same reserve of disciplined attention. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural one. The architecture is designed to exhaust the decision maker before the most important decision arrives. The first portion law eliminates this entirely. When the first portion moves immediately, before any other allocation is considered, the preservation decision is never made under conditions of fatigue. It was made once, in advance, in a state of clarity, and it is not revisited. What remains after the first portion is separated is the only territory the daily mind ever has access to. The rest does not exist in the decision landscape. It cannot be negotiated away because it was never available to begin with. Impulse loses territory. Not through willpower, through structure. This is the hidden mechanism. Immediate separation weakens the psychological conditions that spending requires. Temptation does not operate effectively in the absence of available resources. Remove the resource from visibility before temptation arrives, and temptation has nothing to act upon. Discipline reduces emotional noise, and less emotional noise produces clearer, more consistent financial behavior across every other area of spending. The ancient practitioners of first portion discipline were not simply preserving wealth. They were redesigning the decision environment in which wealth operated. They understood, even without the vocabulary of behavioral science, that structure changes what the mind has access to, and what the mind cannot access, it cannot consume. Now consider the test. Because every principle must be tested before it becomes a law, and the test always arrives at an uncomfortable moment. Imagine a salary earner who has adopted the first portion law for 3 months. The structure holds. The habit is forming. And then a promotion arrives. A bonus. A sudden, unexpected inflow, larger than the usual monthly deposit. In that moment, something shifts internally. The amount feels different. It feels like reward. It carries an emotional signal that says, this is exceptional, and exceptional moments deserve exceptional exceptions. This is precisely the moment the law is either established or abandoned. Because if the law applies only to regular income, if it bends under reward, or under urgency, or under the particular feeling that this time is different, then it was never a law, it was a strategy. And strategies, as established, negotiate. The first portion law applies to all income. every inflow, without distinction between expected and unexpected, ordinary and exceptional. Not because rigidity is a virtue in itself, but because a structure that has exceptions becomes, over time, primarily composed of exceptions. The mind is extraordinarily skilled at identifying reasons why the current moment qualifies as one. Solomon's wisdom did not contain clauses. The diligent plan did not pause for favorable conditions. It was precisely because the structure did not pause that it accumulated. Consistency is not the discipline of doing something when it is easy. It is the discipline of doing it when the emotional argument against it is most compelling. If the law bends under reward, it was never a law. Most of the visible conversation around wealth in the modern world is not about structure. It is about intensity. Work more, earn more, ADD streams, optimize hours, increase output. There is an entire cultural framework built around the idea that the primary variable in financial stability is the size of the input, that if a person simply generates enough, structure will follow naturally. This framework is not only incomplete, in certain conditions, it is actively harmful. Because increasing income without a pre-existing separation structure does not produce stability. It produces a larger version of whatever pattern already existed. The earner who negotiates preservation at month's end with a modest income will negotiate preservation at month's end with a larger income. The scale changes, the pattern does not. More income flowing through a broken structure does not fix the structure, it amplifies the consequence of the flaw. Lifestyle expands faster, obligations grow more confidently. The surplus, if it ever appeared occasionally before, becomes even harder to locate against a background of significantly larger spending. Order is more powerful than intensity. Structure precedes abundance. The ancient merchant who separated first and expanded second did not build wealth in spite of restraint. They built it because of it. Restraint was not the absence of expansion. It was its precondition. Expansion without restraint accelerates fragility. This is not a critique of ambition. Ambition, channeled through structure, is one of the most productive forces a person can cultivate. But ambition without structure is simply a faster path to the same instability, and no amount of hustle changes the mathematics of an allocation order that places preservation last. Something quieter happens to the person who has practiced the first portion law consistently over time. Something that has nothing to do with the numbers in the account, and everything to do with how they carry themselves in relation to money. The emotional charge around income diminishes. For the reactive earner, money is a source of anxiety precisely because it is uncertain, not uncertain in arrival, but uncertain in outcome. There is no reliable structure, so each cycle carries the question of whether this one will be the one that produces something lasting. The emotional relationship with money is tense, charged, dependent on results that the structure was never designed to guarantee. For the separator, the person who has internalized the first portion law, money becomes something different. It becomes material, not in the dismissive sense, but in the practical one. Money is material to be structured. Its arrival is expected. Its allocation is pre-decided. What remains after the first portion moves is the budget for living. Nothing about this is dramatic. Nothing requires emotional negotiation. The mind that does not need to fight for preservation becomes available for clearer thinking across every other domain. This is not a small benefit. The cognitive and emotional bandwidth recovered by removing daily financial anxiety from the decision landscape is substantial. It compounds quietly, the same way the capital itself compounds, not visibly, month by month, but undeniably, across years. Control creates calm, and calm creates clarity. And clarity, applied consistently over time, produces the kind of decisions that the reactive, emotionally charged mind never had access to. Money becomes identity and control, not income size. The practical implementation of this is not complex. Complexity is not what the ancient wisdom modeled. Simplicity, repeated without variation, was always the architecture of durable structure. Income arrives before the mind has time to assign it purpose, before the obligations of the day have entered the calculation. The first portion moves immediately to a designated place, with a designated purpose, investment, reserve, covenant capital that has been decided in advance and is not subject to renegotiation. What remains is the operating budget. It is planned, it is sufficient for its purpose, and it carries no psychological weight because the important decision has already been made. This is not a morning ritual of motivation. It is not a practice of visualization or intent setting. It is a mechanical action performed at a specific trigger, income received with no variation, no consideration, and no delay. The purpose of the designated portion, whether allocated to compounding assets, long-term reserve, or a covenant principle tied to one's deeper values, matters less in the early stages than the consistency of the action itself. What is being trained is not a financial outcome in the first month. What is being trained is an identity. The identity of someone who does not wait to see what remains. Repetition becomes identity. An identity, once formed around this first action, begins to govern every subsequent financial decision from the inside rather than the outside. A calm warning before the final reflection. Impatience is the most common reason this structure is abandoned before it produces visible results. The first month shows nothing dramatic. The second confirms the pattern but delivers no celebration. The third is identical in structure to the first, and because the modern imagination around wealth is trained to expect evidence quickly, trained by a culture that equates speed with effectiveness, the absence of immediate, visible change is misread as evidence that the structure is not working. But compounding does not announce itself in the early periods. It is silent, methodical, accumulating without drama in the background of an ordinary life. The result of this structure is not felt at month 3. It is understood at year 7. It is inherited at generation 2. The ancient framework was not designed for impatience. It was designed for permanence. Solomon did not write Proverbs for people seeking a quick resolution. He wrote it for people willing to adopt a law and live inside it long enough for the law to produce its natural consequence. Years, not weeks, reveal discipline, and quiet structure always outlasts loud urgency. Let the final reflection be this. Diligence, as Solomon described it, was never about the amount of effort. It was about the quality of order. The plans of the diligent, the pre-decided, structured, non-negotiable arrangements made before action begins, lead surely to abundance. Not, perhaps, not occasionally, surely. Because the structure, held consistently, produces the result the structure was designed to produce. The disciplined do not separate first because they have surplus because they separated first. The sequence is not a description of the wealthy, it is the instruction that produces them. Income is loud, allocation is silent. And what is practiced in silence, without announcement, without the need for recognition, without bending under reward or relaxing under pressure, that is what carries forward. Solomon did not expand first, he separated first. Wealth is not income, it is order practiced daily. If this reframed how you think about money and structure, not just what to do, but why the sequence changes everything, then subscribe. The next narration goes deeper into the ancient allocation codes that disciplined households have used across generations to protect what they built. Every video in this series is designed not to motivate you, but to structure you.